Thank you. I'm going to take this down. Oh, it's not, you can't walk around with it. I was hoping I'd be able to walk around with it. So great to see so many people here. And my message, this conference is called Messages for Men. My message for men is pretty much the same as it was 25 years ago when I wrote that book, which is that men need women. And men as a gender need women individually and en masse to recognize and to act on their behalf, to advance the understanding of the kinds of things that Fidel Bogan was talking about and the kinds of things that that Belinda was talking about. I agree with most of what Fidel Bogan said, but I lack his optimism about the ways in which these ideas might spread and develop. And I disagree with most of what Belinda said and remain her very good friend. I will remain in conversation because despite my many efforts over many years with Belinda, she seems not to have grasped what is the central message of my book, which is that the contraceptive revolution and the introduction of infallible contraception and safe, reliable abortion 50 years ago marks the watershed moment in gender relations from all of history up to that point, and from then there's a complete difference, and we're still working out the consequences of the social ramifications of that revolutionary moment. But that's not what I'm going to talk about, because I talk about that in my book, and I'm rather fed up with talking about that. What I do want to talk about, just to touch on as briefly as I can, is three individuals. I want to bring the names of three individuals before you. One is Emily Davison, one is Jan Palach, and one is Zdeněk Hanslik. Now, can I ask for a show of hands, please? Who knows the name of Emily Davison? Very good show of hands. Thank you very much. Anybody want to say who she was, what she did?
The lunatic who threw herself under a horse.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, okay, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, 1913, Derby Day, Epsom Downs. She was the woman who stepped out as the field came around Tattenham Corner, put herself in front of the King's horse, was trampled, died a couple of days later. Okay, her coffin was brought to London on a train to Victoria, and then it was taken through the streets of London to King's Cross, where it went to Morpeth, where was her family home for burial. 5,000 women followed that coffin through the streets of London. 50,000 people lined the streets. This is 1913. Emily Davison has become an absolutely central figure of the suffragette and feminist mythology. There are two museums to her honour, one in Morpeth, one in London. There's a plaque in the Palace of Westminster. On the centenary of her death, Channel 4, Who Else?, produced a documentary about her. There's a play, there are books, poems, no doubt. She will never be forgotten. Okay. Jan Palach, anybody know her? Yes, please.
Yeah, I think it was the chef of the Hungarian uprising. Chair. Thank you. He burned himself to death in protest to corruption.
Thank you very much. In 1969, January 1969, Jan Palach was 21 years old. He set fire to himself on the steps of the National Museum in Wenceslas Square in Prague, and he became, it's very difficult to avoid the word, he lit the spark of, but let's not use those words. From that moment, I mean, his protest was against the Soviet crushing of the Prague Spring of 1968, and it initiated a movement, both in Czechoslovakia as it then was, but also in the Warsaw Pact countries, that you could say led eventually to 1989, 20 years later, the bringing down of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Soviet Empire. Jan Palach is memorialized in the Czech Republic in the way that Jan Hus, the Reformation priest, is remembered. He'll never be forgotten. There are memorials everywhere where he was born and so on. Okay, Zdeněk Hanzlik. Any hands, any names? Nobody. Exactly what I expected. Let me tell you about Zdeněk Hanzlik, whose name I only properly learned to pronounce this morning. Zdeněk Hanzlik, on the 22nd of September this year, 2 months ago, put on a one-man protest outside the Parliament buildings in Wellington, New Zealand, which also houses, I believe, I'm not sure about this, I think the family courts are there. And he held up placards, one of which said, "My vote no, family courts racket." And the other one said, sorry, I'm going to have to look. Sorry. The other one said, in Iran you stone women, in New Zealand, fathers. Then he poured a jerry can of petrol over himself and set fire to it. And he died in hospital of, obviously, terrible injuries 2 days later. I picked up this story on Twitter on the Fathers for Justice site. They had picked it up from New Zealand. I followed it up. There was no name given. There was no media coverage. There was no media coverage at all in the UK, barely any in New Zealand. It took me 10 or 15 emails to the hospital, the police, fathers groups, even to establish his name. Then I found out that he'd been 60 years old, he'd been married to a Japanese woman, marriage had broken down, the courts had permitted the wife to take the children to Japan against his wishes. The children had no connection with Japan. Very, very common story, right? So after all those emails, a helpful guy in Auckland, who was a Mackenzie lawyer, wrote to me and he said, "I don't think anybody would have given a crap about Stan," that was what his nickname was, "if you hadn't taken an interest." And that, my friends, is the truth. Nobody gives a crap. What Stan did is much the same as Emily Davison, very much the same as Jan Palach. Nobody in this room knew his name. And if nobody in this room knew his name, nobody in the bloody world knows his name. Yeah, quite right. And that's the truth that we have to face. I was walking along this morning with this lunchtime with you, and I was thinking back to the moment in October 1991 when I was writing my book, and there was about 2 in the morning. I suddenly thought, am I the only one in the world who's having these thoughts? I really genuinely did. And it was a rather terrifying moment. And of course, when my book was published, the critical establishment said, yes, you are the only one having these stupid, crazy thoughts, and you don't deserve to have any friends, and you won't have any job, you don't deserve to be a father, and you could be bankrupted. But that wasn't the only thing that happened. It also happened that hundreds of people wrote to me from all around the world to say, actually, I've been thinking in very much the same kind of way, which is, of course, tremendously encouraging. And I was thinking that while we were walking, how great to be among so many people. And this genuinely is, like the other people who've spoken, much the biggest audience that I've been involved with in the last 20 years that I've been speaking to this kind of gathering. So great. But it's tiny, it's fractional. Think of those 5,000 women walking behind Emily Davison's coffin. Think of the 50,000 lining the street. Think of what Jan Palach did. This is a fractional minority. And we agree, I mean, the people I've been talking to today agree, the reason is because nobody gives a crap. Now, facing that, how can we get around that? How can we get over that? How can we open the way to what Fidel Bogan was talking about, that kind of wider perception of the truth. My own view is that the key to that transformation lies with women. The Honourable Belinda, God bless you, and all the other women involved here today, Natty, Elizabeth, Paula Wright's not here, but we owe them such thanks for getting this together and bringing this up. And what we need them to do is much more of the same. I want to suggest that women should take the lead by, like, for instance, getting onto NetMums, getting onto Mumsnet, getting onto the Women's Institute and the Mothers' Union, and actually disrupting the conversation there, throwing in intellectual firecrackers, making a difference to the conduct of the conversation on those sites, and thereby bringing more women into this kind of forum. Because I believe that it's going to be women who punch a hole in the wall which is dividing us at the moment. It is the Berlin Wall of our time. It is the apartheid system of our time. It is the totalitarianism of our time, which we have to defeat. And it's down to women, I think, to lead the way, because they have the power. They have the voice. Men do not have the voice. Think of the Weinstein scandal. The reaction of people like Tom Hanks and George Clooney, those useful idiots, as the Soviet Union used to call them, was to say men should shut up and listen, even though the nature of the subject here was the nature of masculinity and maleness. But men have no voice in that. They're just supposed to listen. And in doing so, in saying that, those men, those fellow travellers, are actually uttering the same words, the very same words, as like Suzanne Moore and Julie, what's her name? No, not her, the other terrible Julie. The other really... Birchall, that overinflated slug who's left a trail of poison across the face of British life for 30 years. And what she says is, men, shut up. You have no voice in this. Well, actually, we don't have any voice in this. The people who have the voice and have the power is women. And we need them to lead the way. So, just finally, sorry, I've overdone my time, but I do agree with Belinda wholeheartedly that one of the keys to change here is to concentrate on the position of family. And she and I and others have talked about the creation of a family union, which would represent the interests of the family in workplaces and education, like a trade union, but represent the interests of men and women equally, without any thought of this totalitarian system which has dominated the conversation for the last 50 years. And I believe that that's part of what we need to do. We need to create political institutions and bodies which simply get around the ideological analysis which has dominated the conversation for 50 years and presents a different perspective. So I have written about that in my compilation, which is called Sexual in Politics. And if anybody would like to talk to me about that, I'd love to talk about that, because we do need support for that. And I do have a conclusion. Oh, you don't want to hear that.
Please.
Well, no, it's just bullshit about Martin Luther King. You know, having been to the mountaintop and seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you, but the leaders, I believe, who are going to take us there, actually, a lot of them are in this hall, I believe. Thank you very much.